A single radio transmission. 3 words. Case Yellow approved. It was May 10th, 1940, and in the next 6 weeks, those 3 words would rewrite the rules of warfare forever, topple the mighty French Empire, and prove that sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet. It's an idea that moves faster than your enemy can think. But here's what's haunting. The tactic that crushed France in 42 days would later be turned against its creators in the frozen streets of Stalingrad, where 300,000 German soldiers would learn that speed without substance becomes a death trap. How did the same strategic brilliance that conquered Europe become the blueprint for its own destruction? The answer lies in 6 revolutionary tactics that didn't just change battles, they changed the very nature of human conflict. And once you understand how these tactics evolved, you'll see why every major war since 1900 has been a deadly game of adaptation, where yesterday's innovation becomes tomorrow's vulnerability. Let me take you inside the mind of warfare itself, where brilliant strategies collide with brutal reality, and where the difference between victory and catastrophe often comes down to a single, split-second decision that commanders make in the heat of battle. The first tactic that shattered the old world was called Blitzkrieg, lightning war. But it wasn't just about speed, it was about psychological destruction. Picture this. French generals in 1940 were fighting World War I all over again. They'd built the most advanced defensive line in history, the Maginot Line, an underground fortress system that stretched for hundreds of miles. They were prepared for the slow, grinding warfare of trenches and artillery barrages. They were ready for yesterday's war. Then came the lightning. German tank columns, supported by screaming Stuka dive bombers, didn't attack where the French expected. They punched through the Ardennes forest, a region the French considered impassable for tanks. In just 4 days, German forces had crossed the Meuse River and were racing toward the English Channel. The French army, one of the most powerful in the world, collapsed not because they were outgunned, but because they were outthought. The genius of Blitzkrieg wasn't the tanks or the planes, it was the coordination. For the first time in history, ground forces, air support, and mechanized units operated as a single, devastating organism. While French commanders were still using horses to deliver messages between units, German forces were communicating by radio, adapting in real time, striking where the enemy was weakest, and exploiting every breakthrough with ruthless efficiency. But here's the terrifying part. Blitzkrieg worked so well that it became Germany's greatest weakness. When those same lightning tactics hit the endless expanse of Russia, speed became a liability. Supply lines stretched too thin. Winter became an enemy no radio coordination could defeat. The very tactic that had conquered Europe became the rope that strangled its creators. This brings us to the second tactic that defined modern warfare: the deliberate, grinding horror of trench warfare and attrition. If Blitzkrieg was about speed, trench warfare was about endurance. Who could suffer more and still keep fighting? World War I's Western Front became a 400-mile scar across Europe, where men lived like rats in underground cities, where battles were measured in yards gained at the cost of thousands of lives. The Battle of the Somme lasted 141 days. On the first day alone, British forces suffered 60,000 casualties. The total advance? 7 miles. But this wasn't just mindless slaughter. It was a calculated strategy of exhaustion. The idea was simple: bleed your enemy until they couldn't fight anymore. Artillery barrages that lasted for days. Poison gas that turned battlefields into toxic wastelands. Machine guns that could cut down entire battalions in minutes. The generals knew that whoever could endure the most suffering would eventually win. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers developed something called shell shock. Now we know it as PTSD. Men who had never seen combat were broken by weeks of constant bombardment. The tactic wasn't just about destroying armies, it was about destroying the will to fight. Yet even this brutal approach had a fatal flaw. Both sides became so focused on defensive positions that they forgot how to attack effectively. The war became a stalemate that consumed an entire generation of young men. The very success of defensive warfare made offensive warfare nearly impossible. This stalemate created the perfect conditions for our third tactic: guerrilla warfare. When conventional armies couldn't break through, unconventional fighters learned to disappear, strike, and vanish like ghosts. The Vietnam War showed the world that the most advanced military technology could be defeated by fighters who understood something the generals had forgotten. War isn't just about controlling territory, it's about controlling minds. The Viet Cong didn't try to match American firepower. Instead, they made every village a potential battlefield, every civilian a potential combatant, every step forward a potential trap. Their tactics were brutally simple: hit fast, hit hard, and disappear before the enemy could respond. Tunnel networks that stretched for miles underground, booby traps that turned the jungle itself into a weapon, attacks that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The message was clear: you can never be safe, you can never relax, and you can never win. But the real genius was psychological. Every American soldier knew that the Vietnamese fighter he was hunting might be the farmer he had smiled at that morning. Every village could be harboring enemies. Every path could be mined. The certainty that conventional warfare provided, knowing who was friend and who was foe, evaporated into paranoia and fear. This uncertainty gave birth to our fourth tactic: shock and awe. If guerrilla warfare was about making the enemy afraid of everything, shock and awe was about making them afraid of nothing, because nothing would be left standing. The 1991 Gulf War introduced the world to precision warfare: guided missiles that could fly through windows, stealth aircraft that appeared on radar like ghosts. The CNN cameras showed the world warfare that looked like a video game: clean, surgical, precise. But the strategy was ancient: destroy your enemy's ability to fight before they even know the battle has begun. Operation Desert Storm began with a coordinated assault on Iraq's command and control systems. In the first hour, coalition forces destroyed radar installations, communication centers, and air defense systems across the entire country. Iraqi commanders woke up to find themselves blind, deaf, and unable to coordinate their forces. The war was over before it really began. The 2003 Iraq invasion refined this concept even further. The shock and awe campaign promised to deliver such overwhelming force that Iraqi resistance would simply collapse. And for the conventional phase of the war, it worked. But as we learned, destroying an army and controlling a country are very different challenges. The very success of shock and awe in conventional warfare made it less effective against the guerrilla tactics that followed. Our fifth tactic takes us back to one of warfare's oldest strategies, perfected with modern precision: encirclement and pincer movements. Sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy isn't to attack them directly, but to trap them so completely that surrender becomes their only option. The Battle of Stalingrad shows us this tactic at its most brutal and effective. In 1942, the German Sixth Army, flush with victories from their lightning war campaigns, pushed deep into the Soviet Union to capture the city that bore Stalin's name. They fought block by block, building by building, in some of the most savage urban combat in history. But while they were focused on the city in front of them, they forgot about the vast Soviet forces massing on their flanks. In November 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, a massive pincer movement that surrounded the entire German Sixth Army. 300,000 German soldiers found themselves trapped in a shrinking pocket, cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and hope. The hunters had become the hunted. The psychology of encirclement is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of warfare. Soldiers can fight bravely when they believe they have a chance to win, or even when they can retreat and fight another day. But when escape becomes impossible, when every day brings you closer to death or capture, the strongest army can crumble from within. This brings us to our final tactic, one so brutal that it targets not just armies, but entire populations: Scorched Earth. When retreat becomes inevitable, deny your enemy everything they need to continue their advance. The Soviets, as they retreated from the advancing German army in 1941, burned everything: crops, factories, bridges, railway lines, entire cities. Anything that could be useful to the invaders was destroyed. The policy was simple: let the enemy advance into a wasteland. This tactic requires a terrible calculation. You must destroy your own country to save it. The Soviet people paid an enormous price for this strategy, but it worked. German forces found themselves advancing through a devastated landscape where every mile gained made their supply problems worse. The very success of their advance weakened their ability to continue advancing. But here's what makes these 6 tactics so fascinating. They're not just military strategies. They're windows into the human psyche under extreme pressure. Each one reveals something fundamental about how we think, how we adapt, and how we respond when survival's at stake. Blitzkrieg shows us the power of coordination and speed, but also the danger of overconfidence. Trench warfare reveals our capacity for endurance, but also our tendency to become trapped by our own defensive thinking. Guerrilla warfare demonstrates the strength of adaptability, but also the corrosive effect of uncertainty. Shock and awe displays our faith in technology, but also our tendency to underestimate human resilience. Encirclement tactics show us the importance of seeing the bigger picture, but also the terror of being trapped. Scorched Earth reveals our willingness to sacrifice everything for victory, but also the terrible cost of that sacrifice. What's truly remarkable is how these tactics evolved in response to each other. Each innovation created new vulnerabilities that the next generation of warriors learned to exploit. The trenches that stopped the cavalry charges were bypassed by tanks. The tanks that broke through the trenches were stopped by anti-tank weapons. The conventional armies that relied on superior firepower were worn down by guerrilla fighters who refused to fight conventionally. It's an endless cycle of adaptation, innovation, and counter-innovation. Every solution creates new problems. Every victory contains the seeds of future defeat. The very success of one tactic creates the conditions for its own obsolescence. This is why understanding these tactics matters, even if you'll never set foot on a battlefield. They show us how humans respond to extreme pressure, how innovation emerges from desperation, and how the most brilliant strategies can become deadly traps if we become too attached to them. The commanders who succeeded weren't just the ones who mastered these tactics. They were the ones who understood when to abandon them. They knew that in warfare, as in life, the greatest danger isn't failure. It's the success that makes you stop adapting. So the next time you face a challenge that seems impossible, remember these 6 tactics. Not because you should use them, but because they teach us something profound about human nature. Our capacity to innovate under pressure, our tendency to become trapped by our own success, and our endless ability to adapt, overcome, and evolve. The 3 words that started our story, Case Yellow approved, changed the world in 6 weeks, but they also contain the seeds of their own destruction. In the end, the most important lesson these tactics teach us isn't how to win wars. It's how to recognize when our greatest strengths are becoming our most dangerous weaknesses. And that's a lesson worth remembering, whether you're facing an enemy army or just trying to navigate the battles of everyday life.